All right, folks, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today and for the next couple of weeks is going to be Allison White, talking about transgender students, transgender kids in Silicon Valley. Hang on. This is going to get interesting. She is a principal of a school in Silicon Valley, has dealt with this issue extensively, and I'll tell you in a second how we'll proceed for the next couple of weeks. But let me tell you briefly where this came from. And boy, you don't get this on the other Silicon Valley podcasts. This conversation came from me talking to somebody else, not her, about, I don't know why we were talking about somebody's transgendered kid, and of a sudden, transgender is everywhere, right? It's, there's the TV show Transparent, Caitlin Jenning, it's a big topic, and I was being a little late about it. I was, someone I was hearing about a 3-year-old kid who, decided she was a boy, not a girl, and the joke, oh, well, doesn't your 3-year-old kid also think she's an astronaut? Can you choose your gender? Didn't gay people just get done telling us you can't choose? Isn't that a whole Macklemore song? So, I'm just as funny as the day is long. But as the conversation unfurled with this person, what I realized is it's a very real thing, a very serious thing. And the way I was headed, the way I was thinking, was actually fairly, I hate to say it, but insensitive, but also fairly uninformed, frankly. And so I got introduced or put together with Allison, who knows about this topic as the rest of our understanding of it emerges, and that's where this podcast came from. So I hope you enjoy it. Hope you learn something. The way we're going to proceed for the next couple of weeks, we're going to, it's about an hour conversation. I'll break it into 2 parts, about half an hour this time and then half an hour next time. And then I'll publish the whole thing so people can have it kind of in an archival sense if they want to share it or listen to the whole thing. So anyway, that's it. Transgender in Silicon Valley. Here you go. My guest today, Allison White. This is Something Ventured. Podcast. I am Ken Lindstrom. My guest today, Allison White. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
This is, in this podcast, I explore the reality behind the Silicon Valley headlines as I sit down with the people who are shaping the way we view the world online and beyond. And man, this one, we're going to talk about transgender kids. This is like way behind the Silicon Valley headlines, but I'll let you describe what you do so I don't misrepresent anything.
Sure. So I'm an elementary school principal in Santa Clara County. And so full disclaimer that I'm sharing my specific perspective on this. It's not reflective of necessarily my school district, but it is authentic for my experience.
Yeah. So this came about. Well, you haven't been a principal for a ton of time, right? It's relatively new.
About 4 years, yeah.
I should ask you. We'll talk about transgender, but I was just talking to my sister the other day. The homework. Like every parent I know says there's too much homework. There's more than when they were a kid. Like if all the parents don't want it, like are they blaming all the other parents? Like,
yes, they definitely do that.
What's going on?
There's sort of different camps, and the research is pretty clear that there's 2 different dilemmas in elementary school. There's nothing that supports homework as and having an impact on achievement. Mm-hmm. And parents are, I think, starting to get better informed to say, we believe that the other things going on in our, home at night, being able to be together as a family, soccer practice, all those other things are equally as important, and that kids do their learning during the day, and we need to balance. We need to have some balance. So there's that aspect of it. There's, habits. I think there's teachers that 100% support, appropriate amounts of homework.
Right.
The general guideline, the compromise is about 10 minutes per grade level per night, but that's not ever what ends up happening. And so teachers that do try to cut homework down, they get pushback from just a small group of parents, and unfortunately,
they win.
That they can win.
Well, because you don't want to be the other parent. You don't want to be the parent who's like, yeah, no, my kid needs to not study.
And even in high school, so the research that's been done shows that capping out from middle school to in high school, there is a benefit. You do see an upward trend in achievement based on homework that's done, but it tends to cap out at about an hour and a half, 90 minutes to 2 hours a night.
That's funny.
I know my kids taking AP classes, there's no way. It's hours and hours of homework. And so we have to look up the line when we see that colleges want kids taking AP courses. AP courses generate an incredible amount of homework per night. And so it just starts,
it's
it
so
pushes
funny.
down.
They figured out like the correlation. I remember for MBA school, they figured out that there's no correlation between how you did on the GMAT and how you did in MBA school. There was a correlation, I think, with LSAT. I think if you did well in the LSAT, you tend to do well in law school. But the GMAT, they were like, yeah, it's just simply not correlated. So I was like, is homework really just correlated with smarter kids or not?
It's not. And what's also just as a side note, they are also just starting to look at test optional. Colleges are going test optional for SAT and the ACT. There are more and more colleges for that same reason that are looking and saying what correlates better with kids getting through their 4-year degree is actually their high school GPA and their high school record versus ACT, SAT. And so there are a number of schools, and I think George Washington University is one of the more known ones that are saying it's optional. You can report your test scores or not, and we'll take a look at you either way. Yeah. So it is starting to change. We just need, I think.
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, having a real live principal.
Sure. We could talk about that another time.
So transgender kids. So I bring this topic up, and people listening, you might be the same as me. Maybe not. Maybe I'm the one. But I was having a conversation with someone around like transgender kids. I've done podcasts with, gay CEOs and, women's issues and stuff like that, thinking I'm pretty liberal hanging out here in San Francisco. I realized on transgender stuff, I'm like, I don't understand this. Like, I'm that guy. Like, I'm the guy. I don't kind of get it. I'm saying like kind of snarky stuff, right? Like maybe I identify as being something else that I'm not too. I was like, wait, all of a sudden there's this thing. It's everywhere. It's on TV. There's now kids in school. And I was like, when it comes to like gay issues, there's always been like, I've always been aware of like gay people. And when we were young and I was in school, we were probably pretty insensitive to it, but it existed. Like that concept didn't come up. All of a sudden, I feel like transgender is a thing. And as I started digging into it as a liberal San Francisco person, much less like, someone elsewhere in the country or who isn't even trying to be educated in this thing, I don't know anything about this.
So it's very interesting. I think unless in our lives we have, it's in our context to know this a little bit more deeply through people we know or friends. I think a lot of us don't have deep knowledge of, the transgender. In general, people that experience that as adults, we see it in kind of a public context and on the news and Caitlyn Jenner, and we see adults, but we don't often see, a lot of discussion about what happens with kids because obviously people don't just at the age of 20 or 30 or 40 decide that they're transgender. Right. There's something been going on for a long time. And so it's becoming definitely more present in schools. And so, my personal experiences as a school administrator, I've gotten to know about the issue a little bit more because it is relevant to my work. And it's important to me to always be creating, at my school and within the profession, we look out for kids and protect their social, emotional, and physical safety. That's our primary role. And so anything that could compromise that, we want to be on top of and be, kind of at the forefront of creating safe schools. Yeah. So this falls under that umbrella. But in my work, I've gotten to know about this a little bit better. And I share the same thing. I had very little knowledge. And so when it first kind of came to my attention where I felt like I needed to be a little bit more knowledgeable, I was and I think this is typical, is we kind of lump together sexuality and gender. And that's the first thing. I did it
pretty, I was like, well, of course there's no transgender kid because they're 4. Like how, no, it's like, oh yeah, it's not a sexual thing. Like of course, as soon as you say it and think it through, that's true. But you don't think of like, oh, it's a gay 4-year-old. You're like, I don't know, it's 4. They don't know. They're worried about paste and crayons and things like that. Although some people probably would say you knew that, but it's not a sexual thing, of course. So of course there's kids who are
right. So what families see, and that's the biggest. I think that's the core of the awareness training that schools are starting to undertake for their staff, is that sexuality and expression of sexuality and expression of gender are two completely different things.
Yeah.
And that is probably the most foundational thing to understand about how we can, how it is that we can frame, these discussions about transgender children. And that's it, is that, we all have, there's your sexuality and how you express your sexuality, and that does develop later. But it is completely different. And the core of transgender issues are that for most of us, the way we think about ourselves in our brain lines up with the reproductive organs that we were born with. And so that's all in alignment. I'm female, you're male, and that matches for me. It matches for you. And in a transgender situation, and has nothing to do with sexuality at this point. Right. And so for transgender folks, and for children in particular, there is a difference between their gender identity, how they think about themselves in their mind, and their physical, the way that they were born. And so those two things are important to know about. And then as kids get older and become, somebody who has some autonomy around things they play with, or and not just talking about gender stereotypes, but desires that are consistent, then you see gender expression. Right. And so that can be, those are the key terms to think about when we're talking about children and little ones, and how as they become older, their gender identity starts to become more evident in their gender expression. And when that doesn't match, that's where families start to...
And what age is that would happen?
It is when you look at the stories that are easily accessed on, stories and video that are easily accessed and have been in the news. Parents are aware of these things as early as 18 months when kids start expressing that it might be a little different. And one of the things that I've learned as I've kind of done some research on this is, we all talk about, sure, we hope kids break out of gender stereotypes in their toys, in their play, in their options on clothing, right? It shouldn't be that girls can wear only pink, and or boys can't wear pink, and boys can't wear something that they want to wear. And so I think the rest of us who don't have children, who are questioning that, I think we just think, they're experimenting. And I think you had said something about just like little kids decide, hey, I want to be an astronaut one day, or hey, I want to be this. So one of the key things for and we're talking about like the American Association of the AMA, American Academy of Pediatricians. Mm-hmm. So pretty American Psychological Association, talk about it in terms of when kids are very consistent in what they express, very persistent, and very insistent. They're very insistent on all the time. No, mommy, I'm a girl. Or no, mommy, I'm a boy.
Because that was the next insensitive place that I went, which is, you've always had there's always been the concept of a tomboy, right? That's always been a thing. Mm-hmm. And girls who want to play sports, at some point, they're just girls who want to play sports. Mm-hmm. They're not, so it's obviously something beyond that, using the example of a girl. And tomboy was never negative, going way back, was never really a negative thing. I guess a boy who is acting like a girl was a negative thing growing up to be.
It is much less socially acceptable. And that's, I think this is kind of something that I wanted to bring up. It's interesting that parents are starting to recognize and honor or be aware. It's an awareness that's, I think parents are feeling safer to take note and say, I wonder what this is all about. And I think it's when you see those things where the child is very consistent, persistent, and insistent about that over time, that parents that I've seen interviewed have all said, these are not people that wanted this. Yeah. This is not an easy thing.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing that kind of clicked for me is obviously there's LGBT. There's a whole T in there. Mm-hmm. So it must be it's obviously not an easy thing to do, to have a child who's in this, who's transgender, to be transgender. So obviously it's more than I'm a boy, but I prefer, I don't know, dresses or whatever. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. A couple things are. I mean, obviously it's a significant thing. And I guess not having one of those children, it's difficult not to understand what the nuance is. My daughter wants to run around with the boys and play sports. Mm-hmm. Is that a transgender kid or not? It's obviously not just that. And what do you do? What's your role? What is the parent's role in next steps? And I think that's what I'm seeing is what I understand is that, until a kid hits school,
if they're in preschool and everybody kind of, I think, affords little kids that flexibility socially to know that kids are always experimenting and little ones are, trying on different things, different ways that they like to play. And so, but I think it's when they hit school age, that's where I think most parents start to feel a little more urgency about how to manage that.
So what would the bias, what would you see as another child who's not going to be that sensitive that you would have dissonance with? Like, would it be, oh, that's a girl dressed up as a boy, or is it that they're in the bathroom? Like, what is what would you, how would they get discriminated against?
Right. So I think, there's two different levels. There's at the child level and at the adult level. And I think a lot depends on if children and families have already sort of gotten to a place of feeling comfortable with whatever the gender is that the child's identifying with, and the child starts school fully, transition socially with that identity. So let's say they're, biologically female, but they are, they're identifying male. So they may be dressing male. They may be, appearing male. And I think if you're just starting school and that transition happens before, there's not a big issue, because kids are very, kids are kids. They'll play with each other and whatever. I think it's when that transition happens, when kids have known a student or another child as one gender, and then there's a transition that happens, and now instead of that child being one gender, they're identifying and expressing themselves as the other. And it can be confusing, for kids, for the other kids initially, but kids are incredibly flexible and really way less judgmental. I think it's a different story when that happens, when transitions happen in middle school, high school. I think that's where you see the majority of the bullying and the, the harassment things going on. So my realm is more at that earlier age. And so I think there's far fewer issues, hopefully, because kids are pretty accepting. And across the board, I have to say that I think we're hopefully evolving and moving toward just in general, more accepting place in schools and in the public sphere. But I think that adults have a big issue, that adults are the ones.
That's so the first thing I note is that I guess it's more visible than being gay. Like, I guess you don't, like, you meet somebody, you don't go, oh, that guy's gay. You don't know. I mean, there's some things, but mostly you're just like, I don't know. Like but transgender, I guess you sense it, you see it, you go, oh, that's.
If the transition happened and everybody's knowledgeable about it.
Oh, and you might not know it.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a really compelling thing to know, what is the preference of the family and the child. And so if the child has transitioned socially and no one's aware of it, then it's a private matter, and it's easy. Not easy. It's just, it's not something that anybody, it's private. It's just private.
It's really the weirdest thing, because you've got, weird in that sense, but in the sense of, like, you're transitioning to a different role. At the same time, the roles are not supposed to matter that much. Right. So it seems like just not odd, but it's weird. Like, if everything were the same, would you still be transitioning? But I guess it's the behavioral aspect, not the societal aspect.
Right. Yes. And that's the reason, is that it helps when there's a transition, if the family and the child, have made that decision, whether or not the other settings that they're in, people are aware and honor it. Or it's just very private, and there's the school setting and then there's everywhere else. And so I think a lot depends on how that transition happens. And we're talking just about a social transition at this point, but and it's a transition, and then it's kind of done, in the sense that, if the end of one year of school, you are identifying or socially appearing, female, and then by, when you start the next year, you present your identity, your gender expression is aligned with your gender identity, which is male, then, or vice versa, whatever I said, then people will get over it.
Yeah.
They need to adjust. And that's where, kind of my role and teachers' roles comes into play, is to be very, clear about any student's right to be, for that not to be then cause for mistreatment of any sort at school.
And what is the bias against it? Like, I mean,
it's a discomfort. I think it's just strictly my sense is, for kids, I don't know that for younger kids, I don't think there's a big issue.
Yeah.
I think kids do definitely like to sort things out into broad categories. And so why initially a kid might be confused, they'll get over it.
Yeah.
Other kids will get over it. But I think adults, it's a little harder for adults to kind of, if it's, clearly not their child, their own personal opinion about it. And what maybe that idea of discomfort with what it means for a child to be questioning their gender identity it's not something many of us have had a lot of experience with. And
I wonder if that's not interesting, but like, if you're people who are anti-gay were probably raised that way. They've always just, whatever, it ain't right, whatever brings you to that state of mind. You've probably
from a religious background or whatever.
You've been raised that way. You don't decide when you're 30, I decided I don't like that. With transgender, you probably haven't been raised that way because you never thought about it. So you've got to kind of learn about it and then form a negative opinion about it based on whatever Bible or whatever you look at. Yeah,
or just buy in, I think, on the
it ain't right, or it doesn't look right.
Or just the skepticism. And I think, yes, kids are going to sort of take on, I think, opinions of parents. And, I think depending on what part of the country you're in or, knowledge base around things, again, it's a fairly private thing, because once a child has made a transition, or even if another important term is gender expansive. And so there are students, I will say I had experience with a really interesting experience in the past, where we had a student that appeared to be questioning their gender, but wasn't settled on one thing, didn't make a big, hadn't come to any big decisions. Yeah. It was just a kind of more typical what you expect as kids kind of feel out what fits them, what's right for them in terms of their gender identity. And, I could look at this student and think, I wonder if that's where this particular student was going or not. And I got a call at the beginning of the year this year, and the student had changed schools. And without going into detail, because of a transition in middle school, the locker room PE thing came up, and it blew up. Yeah. And what was so amazing was the school's counselor had the wherewithal to call. And so the day this student appeared to be in crisis, and it was a crisis in that moment, because the student absolutely could not deal with going into the locker room assigned to her, the gender that she had, is on her birth certificate. And I don't think the kid had realized that it was coming to this point themselves. And so what was really nice, and I think it's kind of like what you've said at the beginning of this conversation, this counselor had not had a lot of direct experience with this, but people, I think, maybe I'm naive, I do think people want to do the right thing and just support kids. Yeah. And so she called, we had a really long conversation. We talked through, some things like we're talking about today. And I'm confident that student is not going to have an easy path, because this potential transition might be happening in middle school. And that's where I think kids you get into more kid bias middle school, high school. But here's another thing though, that I have to say that contrasts with that, because I think sometimes in our adult world, our context for all of these things in high school is, 15 to 30 years ago, right? Depending on your age. And so we know how kids that were different were treated regardless of what it was.
Yep. Oh yeah.
And, there wasn't I think out there, the importance of, legally a school's duty to protect kids from discrimination and harassment. And so very interesting last weekend, so our daughter was on homecoming court for, her high school in the South Bay. And one of the students who was on court, so was sort of nominated by staff and students, is gender expansive, meaning
Yep.
not necessarily even choosing one or the other,
Yeah.
is still exploring what that gender identity is like. And so instead of electing a king and queen, this high school had homecoming royalty, and so there was the court, and then two students were elected to be homecoming royalty. So the gender terms of king and queen, I think, are going to be falling away. And one of the students was male, and the other student was the transgender student.
So what did they call them?
Royalty, homecoming royalty. And so
Wow.
this student, I believe, it kind of appears to identify more male in dress. And so they honored that so there were two of the bigger.
Oh, so they weren't just transgender. They weren't identifying as a male. In which case they might say, I'm king.
Well, so I think they honored the students. I'm not quite sure what went on behind the scenes, but they honored the students' preference for the more traditionally male crown versus the princessy, rhinestone crown, which I thought, the student was elected by, her peers. And this is not the first time that's happened at that high school.
Yeah.
That high school a few years back elected a lesbian, definitely not transgender, but a lesbian student was elected homecoming queen. And so I think high school kids, and maybe we're just really fortunate at this particular school that they, I think kids are much more inclined to be accepting of some of these differences than we all were back in the day. Yeah. So this Gunn High School is also, I think their homecoming may have been this past weekend. There was something in the news. They have decided to do away with kings and queens altogether. It's just court is elected, is nominated, and all of those students are honored for their, leadership and contributions to the school culture.
I would guess what the bias is. Well, and also people are now, a lot of, who's the guy, Savage, the gay, he's really
I don't listen to him, but
outspoken. So I grew up, my dad was in the closet forever until his 50s or so. And then when he came out, it was very traumatic for him, but not for me and my sister, because we were in college in the 80s. We're like, oh, okay, cool. Like that's what everyone does. But I think the big thing that happened is like once everyone just met gay people was a lot of it. Like realized who was gay. Like, oh, that guy. I like that guy. And so I'm sure now there's a lot of that too, where if it's known that like I said, you might not be known, but once you know it, you're like, well, I don't know, he's a fine guy, or he's an asshole, or whatever. He's like everyone else. I think that's what happened with the gay. A lot of it was like people's sons came home from college and they had a boyfriend. Mom liked the boyfriend, and
it's about people. It's about people. It's not about that label. And that's why I think it is with transgender kids is that if the adults can all stand down and maybe be conscious of their own discomfort and not project that onto kids and let things unfold and set an example about acceptance and asking questions and being respectful. I think that once the transition happens and the knowledge is there, if the child chooses for it, and I think younger kids, depending on the circumstances, I think younger kids, it becomes less of a big deal. I think the family's choice about how public or private the information is, there's just different contingencies, and families, I think, really have to come to their comfort level with how broad they want that knowledge shared.
All right, we'll stop right there. That'll do it for this week. My guest, Allison White. This is Something About You.